Once we do away with essence and nature, which again, transhumanism is part of this general post-human, anti-human line, is that you get to redefine everything how you want. And so as we're witnessing the death of Christendom, we're witnessing the death of Western civilization, which is really a spiritual death due to us moving away from God's intended telos of creation, the natural law, the natural order, that this is all part of a satanic agenda.
O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
And so one of the first and central points of today's stream is the metaphysical undercutting of Christianity through existentialism. So we've talked a little bit about existentialism and Jean-Paul Sartre and some of the French intellectuals, and of course his compatriot and some of their sexual fiascos, Simone de Beauvoir. She's going to be front and center in today's conversation, because what's central to their philosophical program is what they refer to as existence precedes essence. So you guys are higher IQ than the average bird, right? And so you guys understand human nature, human essence. Things have essences, substance, natures. And this is essential to our Orthodox or just any Christian understanding about humanity, because we can't have God incarnate unless there's a God nature, a divine essence. And we can't have the incarnation of God and the sanctification of humanity and the redemption of us through the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension without human nature. And so throughout Greek philosophy, throughout obviously Christian history, we all sort of took the presupposition that there is essences, natures, and substance in reality, and that these precede existence, right? And we've talked about theologically with the logos and the logi and the divine principles of creation, as some of the church fathers refer them to. And so what happens with existentialism, and just intellectually take you on a little bit of a historical, intellectual historical journey here, is when I did a whole stream with Father Deacon Dr. Ananias on metaphysics. I think it was almost 4 hours. So if you're not familiar with metaphysics, you think I'm talking about the book section in Barnes and Noble that tells you about crystals. We have a different understanding. Metaphysics, philosophically speaking, has to do with the discussions on the nature of being itself. Being, and that's a very big concept when you first hear about it, talking about philosophy. What we're talking about, what is being? That is really what metaphysics was trying to unearth. And we've talked about before with some of the early Greeks, thinking it was water, it was air, it was fire. Then we get to Plato talking about the divine forms. And certainly as Christians, you can't categorize us as essentially Aristotelian or Platonic. We disagree with different attributes of both of those philosophical systems, and they're going to come up today. But for Christians and Platonists in general, there are forms, there are essences, there are natures that undergird our existence. And this is tied with our understanding of being. This is tied with metaphysics and how there is shih tzus and wolves and pit bulls and all this different, but there's dog nature. There's a category that pre-exists the dog itself that connects chihuahuas and gray wolves. There is a nature, there's an essence there. And so in the metaphysical stream that we did with Father Deacon Dr. Ananias, we kind of talked about Rene Descartes and what really becomes the continental and the analytic philosophical traditions. And this is a split on some of the founding presuppositions of how we obtain knowledge. And so when we get to Immanuel Kant and his critique of pure reason, what he's doing is really calling into question much of the metaphysical legacy of Western civilization. And Kant himself was Christian. He kind of made an argument for God based on his deontological ethical approach, kind of ethics and morals. But what he did is Rene Descartes begins his sort of metaphysical, his idealism, his rationalism from the point that he's a thinking entity, right? So He doesn't know about the external world. We can't know anything about external systems or external reality, but he can know that he's a thinking self. And then we have on the other side Francis Bacon, who really is the sort of progenitor of empiricism and the inductive method of science and all this different stuff. Well, then Kant, he undermines both these two lines of philosophical inquiry by saying, well, is the exterior world really totally knowable? And this is essentially the critique of pure reason. We're not going to get into all the details here, but what happens is philosophy has to rethink its program on how it comes to knowledge claims. And so you have what becomes the phenomenological methodology, which turns into German idealism after Kant and leads into phenomenology with Husserl and Heidegger and obviously Sartre. And he then is part of a system that he develops called existentialism. And this phenomenology is arguing that really we don't know the exterior world. All we know is our subjective personal experience. And therefore, why don't we begin philosophy with the study of phenomenology, the study of phenomena as experienced? And this is where we get into intentionality and consciousness and really subjective forms. And this is generally called continental philosophy. On the other end, what's part of the Anglo-American tradition is analytic philosophy, and that comes out of 19th century British empiricism. So in response to Kant, some of the British, the more scientifically minded, say, okay, maybe we don't know the exterior world in and of itself, but what we can do is use the scientific method and come as close as we can to what is knowable. And this leads into logical positivism and all this different stuff, which both ultimately collapse in the 20th century. Now, do they really collapse? No, we're Christians. We believe that there's a telos, there's an order to nature. You can use science. We can know the exterior world. There are essences in natures and creation. So we're part of this historical tradition that through centuries of philosophy has essentially been undermined. But once we get to the mid-20th century, with Sartre, he posits a revolutionary statement that existence precedes essence. And this is where Simone de Beauvoir and her Second Sex book, which was huge, considered really the founding tome of modern feminism, says that a woman is not born, but one becomes a woman, right? So you're not born a woman, you become a woman. Why was this significant? Well, because they're arguing that a woman is not rooted in some type of metaphysical essence or nature, but it's through existential exercise of the will that you gain your essence, you gain your identity. And this documentary that we're going to be looking at today is really moving us through the intellectual importance of these ideas and how, once we do away with essence and nature, which again, transhumanism is part of this general post-human, anti-human line, is that you get to redefine everything how you want. And the existentialism of Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir leads into the work of somebody like Alfred Kinsey. And if you're not familiar with Alfred Kinsey, you will be after today's stream. And he was an absolute degenerate. He was the father of what's referred to as sexology. And I am ashamed that he taught at the University of Indiana University here in Bloomington, Indiana. And this is where he held his sex department, in which he did atrocious things. And he was a married man, and this was more of what's referred to as a beard. It's a covering. He was actually a degenerate homosexual and pedophile. We can say that. And a lot of the work that he did was trying to normalize these sexual orientations, moving from a sort of Freudian base, so that sex is a sort of repressed psychological dimension, and that we in society need to sort of normalize these aberrant forms of sexuality so that people can become more free. And this is where existentialism kind of dovetails into cultural Marxism, because when we look at our documentary today, they're going to be talking about some of these Marxist roots. Now, existentialism is not the same thing as critical theory. It's not the same thing as cultural Marxism, even though in the documentary, those are going to be used kind of synonymously. But I put together a document that again, will be up on the website for all the website members for $5 a month, in which it really provides a detailed overview of Simone de Beauvoir, Jean Paul Sartre, what is existentialism, what is cultural Marxism or critical theory, how do things relate? And it really centers on the oppression, right? So Marxism, as you understand, Karl Marx, the whole thing was about economic oppression, right? So the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the working class. Well, this structure of power dynamics and looking at the oppressed versus the oppressor, this framework is essential because for existentialism and for the gender agenda, which we're going to be trying to uncover and discuss today, it is all about this idea that they have to undermine specifically Christianity, specifically the patriarchy, and specifically the nuclear family, so that humanity can liberate itself into a new orientation, a new man, right? Because essences in nature and all this theological stuff is all bunk for them. So this is really the thrust of there's a lot of things that have led to the collapse and the death of Christendom, but we're witnessing it, and at the same time we're witnessing its revival. As I said, multiple streams. Dyer shared an article, it's probably now about 3 weeks ago or so, on X, highlighting that Orthodox Christianity in America has moved from like 700,000 to about 7 million. That's a phenomenal increase just since 2020. That's in 4 years. And so as we're witnessing the death of Christendom, we're witnessing the death of Western civilization, which is really a spiritual death due to us moving away from God's intended telos of creation, the natural law, the natural order, that this is all part of a satanic agenda. And it's ultimately led and fueled by a sort of sexual revolution that re-understands and reforms anthropology as an entity that exists on a Darwinian evolutionary spectrum, and therefore you have no nature, you have no essence, you currently reside in your historical context, your evolutionary context, but we can then change these things. And that's what is the gender agenda. It ultimately is demonic. It ultimately is a trick by the devil. And the nuclear family is front and center of the attack. And we've already seen this stuff. The Democrats within, obviously, you guys know that the election's November 5th. You can't get away from it in American culture right now. But the recent ads by the Democrats is a guy masturbating in bed, talking about how they want to take away your pornography, him sleeping with a white, well, of course, it's a white male and a white female are having intercourse, premarital intercourse. He claims the condom broke. And then the Democrat ad is about Plan B and abortion so that they don't have children. And you may think that these are sort of just modern sentiments, that these things are just, not as pernicious as maybe I'm going to make them to be, but they really are. And the whole point, as what the documentary is going to uncover today, is that this is all rooted in a deep, deep hatred for Christianity and Christian metaphysics and the legacy of Christianity and its normalization of societal structure and the nuclear family. And so what we're discussing, as I said, is a flip on Christian metaphysics, in that it's ultimately a sexual revolution against the Mother of God. Because when we listen to Simone de Beauvoir, we listen to Sartre, we listen to Alfred Kinsey, which we're going to see today, what is one of the common denominators of all of them is that they hate everything that the Mother of God, our Theotokos, embodies: purity, piety, virginity, chastity, and of course, family. So we look at the modern woman and we see the OnlyFans. We see the biggest thing that women want to vote for in America right now, typically single women, is for their reproductive rights. But what rights? These aren't rights, because what are rights? This is something that Andrew Wilson has talked about, but they use the rhetoric of rights, and it's not about reproduction. It's about the lack of reproduction. Because again, there is no human nature. There is no ontology to who you are. And so the unique qualities of women, their sexuality, their ability to give birth, their ability to be caretakers and mothers and stewards of life, these things are annihilated in the face of the gender agenda. And so we can see the demonizing of motherhood, the demonizing of marriage. I recently just saw that Time magazine, which we're going to see was a major promoter of Alfred Kinsey's pedophilic research, where they would literally masturbate children at like 5 months old. They were doing this in a laboratory. They were masturbating children. And we're going to find in the documentary one example of a girl who was being molested by her father, and Alfred Kinsey was paying him for the research on how quickly she could orgasm as a child, as like an 8-year-old girl. This is the type of stuff that Alfred Kinsey was involved with. And so Time Magazine just posted at least I saw on X, the front cover of it was about how true freedom is not having children. And it shows two a white couple, a white male and a white female, laying on the beach, childless, enjoying their lives, enjoying the fruits of what? Consumerism, materialism, which is going to be a feature that roots existentialism and cultural Marxism together. And so it's undermining, and there's specific about it, especially when they start talking about these feminist meetings they had in the mid 20th century, that they have to undermine the Christian patriarchy. And the way that they want to undermine the patriarchy is through the nuclear family. They literally state this, that the ways in which you take away man's collective power in society is to take away his importance within the family. So we see the attack on fatherhood. We see the no-fault divorce in America and what really Western civilization. This isn't by accident. These people are infiltrating institutions. This is part of the Gramsci Marxist method, is that you infiltrate so that you can coordinate and then maneuver the institutions to fit your ideology. And that's exactly what's occurring. And so this is literally rooted in a spiritual war against God's creation. That's the whole intensive purpose here. And we can see the archetype of Baphomet, right? The half animal, half man, half male, half female. This is part of both Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre and Alfred Kinsey. They're all for minor attracted persons, bestiality. Simone de Beauvoir even made the point that there's nothing wrong with bestiality because man himself, collective entity with no essence, is only an animal. And therefore, they make philosophical arguments in their radical feminist existentialist school that really there's nothing wrong with having sex with animals. Everything, again, that's in opposition to our tradition. But we can see something of the archetype of the Baphomet, the Jezebel, the harlot, the Lilith figure, that this is the attack, and the way that the evil one is going at man is really the attack on women. And so we've talked about this before. Obviously, the pornography, the sexual gratification through social media, the OnlyFans, these girls making millions of dollars a month by selling themselves online. This is a selling of your soul. That's what's happening. That's what we all do when we're committing these sins over and over and over again. But we're living in a time in which these people in the early 20th century literally said the only way that they can destroy the Christian patriarchy of America, which really just is symbolic of the whole Western world, is by promoting sexual promiscuity, premarital sex, homosexuality, and aberrant forms of sexual expression. That by doing this, the women will follow suit, which we've seen obviously has played that course out. The men will be led, especially in a world with no meaning, a world with no orientation through the church, a culture that's divorced from God, that the men will then follow their sexual desires. And this really is, my argument here is that culture, what we're witnessing in the Western world, really is a sexual magic ritual. Sex magic is happening in our face, whether it be, we talked about the symbolism of the Lady Gagas and the Beyoncés and all these pop stars in the world, right? But the whole thing is about inflaming sexuality, getting women to create their identities based off their sex, and getting men to be so lustful and gluttonous that they will fall into this magical self-destruction of our own societies, our own communities, and our own families through sex. And sex is, according to Freud and according to Alfred Kinsey, sex is this sort of ultimate energy that's budding up within men and women, and for them has to be released from the oppressive confines of Christian morality. But really, for what I'm arguing, and the documentary makes a point of how Aleister Crowley and various people working in the occult were part and parcel of this movement, because it is a magical ritual of us getting to destroy ourselves, because sin is death. It quite literally is. When we sin, we are dissipating the uncreated energies of God, and we literally are killing ourselves. And when we look at Western civilization, the whole thing is self-destructive. The whole thing is about killing itself, whether it be, look at whatever you want. It could be the food. Look at the medicine, big pharma. Look at the military industrial complex. Look at the economy and the US dollar. Everything is self-destructive. Everything is inverted. And the inversion of God, the inversion of justice, and the inversion of morality is one of the things that is going to be mentioned in this documentary that is explicitly part of Satanism and part of their agenda. And so this is all a blurring of distinction. This is all blurring of boundaries. And this is why metaphysics really is the central battleground of how Christendom is being deconstructed and is dying before our eyes. And it takes men and women to fight against it by getting married, having families, and living Christian values. And that is a generative effect, right? When we talk about generation and generosity in the book of Genesis, it all relates to creation. It all relates to something growing. And ironically, the gender agenda, we see that gen, that prefix, that point that all these words connect to, that gender is being weaponized, inverted, and is literally leading to the death of people through the gender agenda. It has nothing to do with procreative processes. It has nothing to do with the promotion of life. It is literally satanic. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So smash that like, guys. I want to show you a little bit of my document before we get going here. And then we're going to be watching the rest of this documentary called A Wolves in Sheep Clothing, The Gender Agenda. And it's, again, a Catholic documentary, but it is very good and well done. And it even brings up the COOF. We may have to skip a few sections of the documentary, but here's the document that I put together. And we're not going to read the whole thing. This will be up at the website, again, for members for $5 a month. So if you want access to this, please go to my website, become a website member. It's $5 a month. Here's the link right here, and I'll promote that in just a second. But this kind of gives an overview of the philosophies of Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, the key tenets of existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophy focused on individuals' experience of freedom, choice, and responsibility, right? Which is they're couching in this agenda. Again, that's why existentialism is actually subversive. Not that we don't have free will and liberty and choice. And of course we believe that, but that's part of our imago Dei. That's part of being made in the image of God. For these people, this is a way in which they can talk about any sort of moral confine, any moral restriction our society places on them as something that needs to be liberated from. So it emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, primarily through thinkers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and then later Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. It is deeply concerned with the subjective nature of human experience and the challenges individuals face in creating meaning in a world without inherent purpose. Existence precedes essence. We just highlighted that this is a central metaphysical doctrine of existentialism. And you could point out Marxism, anything that is based in this sort of relativity and this new anthropology posits that there is no essence, there is no nature, there is no substance to the world, and that existence is a chaotic expression of biology and matter, and therefore essence is something that we create. There is no essence. Radical freedom and responsibility, alienation and authenticity, absurdity and search of meaning, death and finitude. And then here's Marxist cultural theory, how those things relate. And then these are the points in which they really come together: freedom and alienation, authenticity and class consciousness, critique of bourgeois culture, which really was a critique of Christian morality, the role of culture, and then revolutionary potential. And so the existentialist Marxism and critical theory, I have a little bit of an overview here. Here's a little bit about how, again, the gender agenda plays into Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir's work. So homosexuality, de Beauvoir and Sartre's perspectives on homosexuality aligned with their existentialist belief in freedom and individual choice. De Beauvoir herself experienced relationships with both men and women, advocating for the legitimacy of same-sex relationships at a time when such topics were largely taboo. Sartre, while he did not focus on homosexuality specifically, viewed all sexual relationships as part of an individual's right to express their freedom and autonomy. Unconstrained by societal norms, these views, especially Beauvoir's encouragement of same-sex relationships as an expression of personal identity, i.e., again, this sexual magical ritual is getting people to create their identity through their sexual proclivities, right? We've talked about how trans identity, furry identity, homosexuality, minor attracted persons, that what's happening in our culture right now, the gender agenda, is getting people to identify who they are, their quote unquote, the essence of who they are, divorced from being made in the image of God, but tied with their sexual proclivities. And this was at the core of what their goal was. And so same-sex relations as expression of personal identity and freedom are at odds with traditional Christian teachings, which view homosexuality as incompatible with biblical teachings on sexuality and marriage. What about pedos and bestiality? In a controversial light, de Beauvoir and Sartre's legacy is complicated by their permissive attitudes towards certain practices that are broadly condemned in society. Oh, really? What are those? In the 1970s, they were among a group of French intellectuals who signed petitions calling for the decriminalization of certain sexual behaviors, pedos, including with minors, under the assertion that such laws restricted personal freedom and were repressive. You see how the game works here. Anything that butts up against this degeneracy is viewed as oppressive. Therefore, they're the oppressed, and the oppressor, the Christian hegemony of our culture, that needs to be deconstructed. This has been widely criticized, with many arguing that it contradicts contemporary values around consent and the protection of vulnerable individuals. From a Christian perspective, these permissive views stand in opposition to the sanctity of the person and the concept of moral responsibility, as Christian ethics hold that sexual activity should respect the dignity and well-being of all individuals, particularly minors, within the context of marriage. I should have added that. And then here's my little discussion on existence precedes essence and why that is so important and how it contrasts with Christian metaphysics. Again, this whole document will be up at my website for anybody who's interested. So smash that like. And if you want to get access to all these notes that I've been creating, they're up at my website for $5 a month. So a few of them is the origin of meaning and purpose, freedom and responsibility. What is freedom? Freedom is our free will to align with God's will. Essence of human nature, ethics and morality, view of the soul. These are a few things that are at odds. And then I have a little overview of the sexologist Alfred Kinsey, a total degenerate that was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. If you're not aware, of course, was backed by the Huxley brothers, the eugenicists, and them being Fabian socialists, all that different stuff. And so Kinsey's work, who's going to be a very prominent feature in today's video, it comes out of positivism and empiricism. So Kinsey approached sex from a strictly empirical standpoint, although really it was a cover for his own degeneracy and that he could probably participate in these things. He forged his evidence. So like one of the things on his work right here, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male in 1948. Again, this is right after World War II, guys. This is very early, before the counterculture and all that different stuff in the 60s, although it was the catalyst for it. This is, again, an under-discussed dimension of the trans fiasco and the gender agenda and these LGBTQ movement within our current society. But Kinsey basically got like 300 people from prisons that already were like sexual deviants to do his research on. So the pool of which he built his entire work on how homosexuality was natural and that people had these repressed sexual feelings for children and all this different stuff, and that children can have orgasms as early as 5 months old. This is what he was doing in his laboratory, and he was choosing a sample pool of participants for his research that were already sexual psychopaths in many different ways. So all his books, the evidence that even he produces is called into question because he forged the numbers and he created all this different stuff. So it comes out of empiricism, sexual as empirically studied, right? And then it's tied with Freudian theory. So while Kinsey wasn't strictly a Freudian, it parallels Freud because of its emphasis on sexuality as a fundamental aspect of human life and personality. Freud's theories of repressed sexuality and the importance of understanding the unconscious may have provided, I mean, it did provide, I'm being generous here, Kinsey with a philosophical framework for destigmatizing and normalizing diverse sexual expressions. And then, of course, social Darwinism and the concept of natural behavior. Kinsey viewed sexual behaviors as natural biological impulses. This is, again, existence precedes essence. This is the message today. If you can take anything away from this stream, remember that these people believe that existence precedes essence, which is totally contrary to our Christian metaphysics. And so they are free from inherent moral constraints because there is no nature, there is no objective moral law. His research aimed to demonstrate that many sexual behaviors considered taboo were actually natural and part of a broad spectrum of human sexual diversity, similar to variations found in other species. Yeah. And so the controversial aspects of his research, the data on sexual experiences of children. So like in table 34 in sexual behavior of the male details data on the sexual experiences of children, including infants. The table includes information about children as young as 5 months old, as I said, documenting their reactions to various sexual stimuli, meaning in a laboratory setting, these people, in the name of science, masturbated 5-year-old children or 5-month-old children. Absolutely horrendous and heinous. And so, guys,